I'm so happy to see everyone this morning. Welcome. My name is Ann Dodge. I'm the Executive Director at the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation here at the University of Chicago, and I'm going to be your MC for the next day and a half. Please feel free to share pictures, video, text, via whatever social media channels you prefer. We have a hashtag for today and tomorrow. It is hashtag Shy Global Symposium. And your hosts today are at MI Urban Chicago, at UN Habitat, and support from the Ford Foundation, which is at Ford Foundation. And now, my last thing I want to point out and give a huge round of thank you to our partners at the Siebel Center for Design at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Everybody should have one of these. Did you get one of these? Yes. This beautiful thing. This is called your synthesis workbook. Yeah. Have you ever had a synthesis workbook before? Probably not. You have one now. This is the way we hear from you. So every single panel today has a sheet in here that asks you what, so what, and now what. And your job is to fill this out and put it on the box in the middle of each table so we know what you thought of the panel, what it makes you think about next, and what you think your next steps are. What is the call to action? So that's what the first part of the book is. And the last part, this I love. You see these pages with this thingy, this QR code? Every one of these pages is erasable. You should have gotten an eraser and a marker. This is for you to take notes throughout the day, scan, and everything that every single person in this room scans and uploads via this QR code is going to go into a shared box. You're going to see it all on this screen over here where our lovely synthesis squad from UIUC is here to help you use the book, help you figure out what am I doing and how does this work and where am I going to see this information in the future. It's all public, you're all a part of it. So I really encourage you to use this as a tool in addition to networking with each other, in addition to Q&A opportunities. We really, really want to hear from you because that's what this event is about, the people in this room. Okay. So please feel free again with any questions to come and find a person from the Mansueto staff. And I think I'm ready to introduce our first opening speaker. Please join me in welcoming your event co-host, Professor Luis Bettencourt, Inaugural Director of the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation at the University of Chicago.
Good morning, everybody. It's a really great pleasure to see you all in this room and with us for the next few days. I know that many of you came from very far away. For those of you that did that, we really appreciate it. It's very important for the kind of discussion and hopefully a little bit of synthesis that we'll have over the next 2 days, that we hear voices from all over the world with different experiences, and that we hear in specifically your vision for your cities and your communities. Why the symposium? We brought you here and because we think there's an idea that's latent, that's sort of very important, that we're all working on, but that in some sense is not formed yet as a way of working, of creating essentially traction on the problem of our generation, which is how do we think about sustainable development that's global, that's human-centric, that addresses issues of climate, but that really creates capabilities and dignified life and a life of opportunities for everyone in the planet without destroying it. I think we're all conscious of this, but this problem, as you know, is urgent, both from the human side and from the point of view of climate, but it's a problem that we still don't know how to solve. As an academic, I think I can say this more than if you are in policy. And as such, I think it's a problem that's been looking for a scale, an agent, a group of people at an appropriate size that actually can make the needle move. And I think the evidence from just the last few years is showing that that scale is around the scale of cities, where in many ways we can bring together people, where we have politics with capital P, as I like to call it. Politics means the stuff of cities. In the original, we should grab it back. And of course, when you look at cities, it means also looking at communities, neighborhoods, places where people live together, where the human experience is shaped, and where people are enabled or disabled from participating in civic life, from being creative. And we know that from in a variety of ways, from things we'll discuss throughout the symposium, all the way from a lot of work that's been done here in Chicago in academia, but I think you see it in your own communities all over the world. So I think that because of all this, we're learning more. We have different knowledge, we have new connections, we can all be here from many different parts of the world. And it is from that perspective that we can rethink and reshape what we need to do with sustainable development everywhere. I want to give you just a little bit of sense, since I have the word here to get us started, of what this place is, where you are a little bit, for those of you who came from far. So you are, of course, in Chicago. I think you realized a little bit if you came to the reception yesterday that this is a city that's complicated. We're not telling you that Chicago is a model for what we want to do here. It's a city that historically integrated a lot of people, grew very fast, but also is a city that's immensely segregated, especially by race and by income. And you see this in the structure of neighborhoods, particularly here around the university. Out of that struggle, which continues to be a struggle, but many good things have also come. And I think those are the places and the ideas that give us hope, and that will animate also some of what we'll be doing over the next 2 days. In particular, here at the university, it's a place that is full of debates, and it's a place that historically created very important ideas, particularly in the social sciences. So one idea that's very important that animates all that we do with the Institute is this idea that cities really are, in the original, it was called a human ecology. So they're a place in which they're complicated environments in which we have to fit and we have to try to prosper. But it's not an environment that, is determined just by what we build or by who we are as individuals. It's a complicated web of interdependencies that allow us to have a good life or not. And from that perspective, how we manage that web and how we make it better is a complicated problem that has to involve many different people. And that's the spirit in which also the symposium is supposed to work. But just to illustrate it with a few people that you may know, this is a place where many important thinkers came through, from Jane Addams, who was the first American to win the Nobel Prize for Peace, who was concerned in the beginning of the century with poverty in the city, but then peace, to Saul Alinsky, who was a very famous community organizer, at least in the context of the United States. He's somebody that started here in criminology and sociology, then sort of rejected academia a little bit, but that was organizing people just in Woodlawn. And for those of you that will take the Woodlawn tour in the afternoon, you'll see sort of the heritage of those ideas. There was, sort of continue on that tone, there was a young Bernie Sanders here in the 60s, it's the place where it's supposed to have gotten socialism, at the same time where, if you know that period, a lot of people here were getting capitalism. So, it's that kind of debate that is interesting. And of course, you are in Obama land. This is the place where Michelle grew up, just a few blocks from here, close to where we were for the reception. It's the place where their early careers developed. Barack was a professor at the university in the law school. And so this is a place where he tried to be a community organizer, which he was pretty good at, and where he was dealing with ideas from Alinsky and others, but where sort of a lot of the identity for the politician that he'd become, and more to the point, I think, to the vision that he was elected with, was created. It was out of the struggle of seeing, how communities in a city like Chicago really strive for a better life and struggle with the structures of a city, but also how these environments can make it possible. So this is a little bit the context of sort of this place. And in many ways, our institute is trying to be grounded in that tradition, but also look ahead. And this is, again, what this symposium is about. We think that working on sustainable development, but more to the point in cities worldwide, is in the 21st century, a young century still, is really about being global, thinking about cities and communities everywhere, where the human experience is much richer, more complicated. But look at us, we can connect, right? We can connect in many different ways that we couldn't before. So I can learn from what your experience is like, you can hear about Chicago, and out of that, I think we'll find differences, but we'll find a lot of points in common, problems that we need to solve in ways that we haven't solved anywhere. like the problem of sustainable development. It's an era also of information. We have new tools, new data, new ways of creating things that mobilize people for good and bad. So how do we use that will be a big theme of the symposium. And I think it's an era where increasingly knowledge, I'm not saying that roads and infrastructure and the things that have been sort of the most important things in urban planning are not important. They are important, and we'll be talking about them. But knowledge, the way we do things, the way we understand the human condition, the way we conceive a future that's sustainable is key. And that's, I think, what we can do as a community here, is try to think about what that framework is in a way that is true to people and to that change. So with that spirit, in that sense, I just want to give you just a little bit general sense of the flow of the symposium. So we'll start with a first panel, which is sort of a framing panel that will try to convince you, and I think of things you already know, that we are in some sense in more global, more urgent, but more connected reality with more data that allows us to do different things. Then we'll have an important panel on community organization, which is a lot of the grounding of all this. And we'll be doing an experiment of having some of you, you know who you are, I'm looking at you, of bringing people from several different continents that work very locally to see what they might have in common and how they see this moment from their perspective, and in many ways the way that work is articulated as a global voice. We'll have then panels on, we have field visits, so again I mentioned some will be with community organization here around the neighborhood, and the other option is to visit with the Obama Fellows. This is a group of young fellows who are being trained and being networked to be some of the future civic leaders, not just in the US and Chicago, but around the world. They're a very interesting group of people, very much like you, and I think that will be an interesting conversation. And I think the Obama Foundation needs to hear from you a little bit about what it means to be a civic leader in the world at large. And then we'll have tomorrow important panels on climate, on architecture and design and planning, and how that is dealing with the actual situation of the cities we have, on how to think of funding the changes ahead, and on technology and its role and technology, how it's bridging the human scale increasingly. So that's more or less what I want to say in terms of what we'll be doing the next few days. It's going to be a very intense couple of days, hopefully. We want to promote a lot of dialogue, and we struggle a lot about how to organize the symposium. So what we'll be doing is to have panels that have short presentations. So we have to pick some people to be voices of, synthesis and provocation, if you will. They'll be in the panels. But each panel will have time for discussion, and we have several channels they'll be hearing about and already introduce you to some, as to how we bring voices together, we hear everybody, and also try to synthesize new knowledge. So with that said, I hope you have wonderful 2 days. I know it's a little bit cold for those of you who came from warmer parts of the world, but this is a beautiful autumn weather in Chicago. And I hope you enjoy being here, you enjoy the new contacts that you make. We want you very much, if nothing else, to just get to know each other, somebody different. There are mechanisms to do that you can hear at our different desks. That's what those little colored tags and so forth are for. So use them, have fun, and hopefully as we go, we'll be creating some of the synthesis of ideas that will allow us to move forward. So with that said, I want to introduce our partners in this organization at UN Habitat. Chris Williams, who is an alum of the university, and he might tell you a little bit about that too. That's a bit of a coincidence, I think. At least that's my story.
Thanks very much, Luis. Let me, as a UN civil servant, I'm very sensitive to government and protocol. Apologies, but I need to recognize Ivan Akisoyer, the mayor of Freetown. Really grateful for your presence here. It's wonderful that you were able to make this part of your very busy life and schedule. And thanks very much to the participants here coming from really different institutional contexts, very different parts of the world, dealing with a set of questions that Luis, I think, outlined very nicely. It is terrific to be here. I'd like to, often we thank people at the end, but I just wanted to get that out. A lot of people made this gathering possible, and I just want to recognize folks from the Mansueto Institute, of course, Luis, who we just heard, Anne and Grace. There are many others. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank both Elena Beverly and her boss, Derek Douglas, the Vice President of Office of Civic Engagement here at the University of Chicago, without whom we would not have been able to organize this. And as well, I'd like to thank my colleague, Naomi, She and I have come from New York, where we're based at the United Nations. And I'd also like to recognize from Champaign-Urbana, Ruby Mendenhall and Raquel Switchke. Thanks very much for joining this conversation and being part of this effort. We really appreciate your presence here. So thanks to those co-organizers and the individuals that have made this gathering possible. I'd like to talk about three different things in a very short period of time, so excuse me if I talk too quickly. The first is a bit of the global context that is we're operating in. The second is to look at what kind of organization is necessary to address some of the global challenges Luis talked about. And then lastly, to kind of look at the neighborhood level as a space of intervention, action, engagement, and also accountability. In terms of the global context, maybe I'm just in a bubble in my New York UN world, but I see this in the time that I've been in the UN as perhaps the most intense in terms of global issues that are affecting the planet as a whole. It used to be sort of one part of the world was affected, or one part of a city was affected, but it didn't really affect the rest of the world. And I think right now we're talking about a climate crisis. It's no longer the discussion of climate change. We are in a climate crisis. We have about 12 years to change fundamentally how we produce and how we consume if we're going to have a generation for grandchildren and great-grandchildren that is like the one that we have now. At present, on our current track, it's going to be frightening for that generation. Absolutely frightening. We have 12 years. We have to make a difference. In terms of inequality, it's expanding. Yes, there is significant, at a global level, improvements. I bet roughly 100 million people have left poverty over the last 10 years, and that is something to be lauded. However, the degree of inequality that's existed in our societies, both at a global level, regional level, national, and down to the neighborhood, is really significant. And it's something that is tied directly to our consumption and production. So this issue of climate change and climate action, climate crisis, is very much connected to dealing with inequality. Having a social and economic justice foundation for dealing with climate change will be absolutely essential. And I think I'm very impressed that we have a dedicated session on this. We'll hear more about it this two-day period. The last is economic growth. We estimate in the United Nations that in order for the world to be operating at a reasonable standard of living, we need roughly an average of 7% growth rates globally. How is that going to take place? And how is it going to be sustainable ecologically? And how is it going to be for everyone and not a small group of people? Getting that 7% level of growth in a sustainable manner is really a major challenge for us today. The economic basis of production, the playing field is not fair globally. We're finding that various regions and countries are cut out of global markets in ways that are repressing their parts of the world to the degree where the social programming is just a Band-Aid on what should be a much more significant engagement in global economic matters. And so therefore an economic growth strategy is also one of equity and ecological sustainability. Lastly, we have the highest level of migration in the world since 1945. People are on the move. They're escaping persecution, economic. They're also escaping climate. They're leaving very drought-intensive areas, areas that have extreme weather and the effect of that. They can't maintain their livelihoods where they are, so they're on the move. And this degree of relocation and dislocation that's occurring is not just across borders, it's also within countries. Population of internally displaced is also the highest it's been since 1945. So this issue of migration and movement, of course, is affecting our politics. We see it in this country, we see it in many parts of the world. How migration becomes part of the migrants, become part of the fabric of a country becomes extremely essential when thinking about sustainability issues that I've just been discussing. So that social piece is not just a socioeconomic difference, it's also inclusion. And to what degree are we excluding populations and including populations as part of urban planning processes, as part of our national conversation? It used to be that 70 to 80% of refugees ended up in refugee camps. Now it's 70 to 80% are ending up in cities, often in informal settlements and slums around the world. They're part of an urban poor population where they are struggling in their new locations, trying to make sense of their new localities. Extreme cases of that would be the Rohingya population in Myanmar, where over 1 million people moved into Bangladesh in a place called Cox's Bazar in a shift that has fundamentally changed that part of Bangladesh. There's no refugee camp strategy that could possibly be put in place. There had to be an urban planning strategy to accommodate a million people moving across a border. But could it be permanent? Did it send the wrong political signal? These people would like to be back to where they came from. How is that done? So the question of another major challenge, just to summarize, is the climate crisis, the inequality, the economic growth, and also migration, and how that's dealt with. And we refer to that in the UN as urban crisis, both how to reduce that and prevent it from happening, and how to respond to it when it occurs. Broadly, these four areas are areas that the United Nations as a whole has been able to think much more seriously about urbanization. Urbanization statistics are quite daunting. In 1960, roughly 40% of the world's population was living in cities. In 2000, it hit the 50% mark, 2002. We're now at about 54 to 55%, and by 2050, 70 to 72% of the world's population will be living in cities. So Luis's comment earlier about we really need to think much more seriously about the cities, and the Honorable Mayor here is dealing with this on a first-hand basis. This question of how urbanization takes place, how cities address increase in population, becomes paramount to dealing with these questions of inequality, how we deal with the climate question and crisis that we're unfolding, and how we deal with economic growth and migration. Rapid urbanization is a fact of the world. It's most intense in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly East and Southern Africa, and in South and Southeast Asia. Those regions are the ones that are experiencing the fastest growth. In a broad picture, there are roughly 2,000 cities in the world with a population of at least 500,000 people that will double in size in the next 30 years. Is that an opportunity or a crisis? We have to really be dealing with this issue at the global level. Is it an opportunity because the way you build that city, the way you design it, the way you engage different populations becomes essential for dealing with all the issues that I've just mentioned. If you don't deal with planning and urban development in that way, you're allowing all of these existing problems to exacerbate, and you're creating a recipe for disaster. So how do we manage this urban growth as a community? How do we get involved at different levels? So this is the macro picture, and I'm sorry I'm summarizing a lot of issues in a very short period of time, but I just wanted to give you a bit of global context for the work we're doing. So how is the world dealing with this? How are they organizing? Well, at the UN level, where I work, member states have taken quite a number of steps. One is that they've developed the Sustainable Development Goals as a community in 2015, where they've mapped 17 areas that they hope by 2030 to improve. A lot of it touches on these issues. There is a dedicated goal on cities and communities. Sustainable Development Goal 11. They're also very concerned with climate. The Secretary General hosted a meeting on the 23rd of September called the Global Climate Summit, and he convened member states from around the world, as well as cities and their organizations, as well as various stakeholders from the business community and in some cases from grassroots and non-governmental organizations and foundations. Really putting the pulse on, putting the world attention on the climate crisis and really getting people to think through how to deal with it. This is something that he's going to roll out through the rest of the UN system with member states over the next 10 years. It's not a one-off event on the 23rd of September. In terms of the part of the UN system where I work, it's called UN Habitat, the United Nations Human Settlements Program. It's the part of the UN system that deals with housing and urban development. We are charged with really dealing with the question broadly of sustainable urban development in the ways that Luis has just described earlier. We are not operating in isolation as we used to as a dedicated UN agency. we have developed a plan as part of the wider UN system called the System-Wide Strategy on Sustainable Urban Development, which the Secretary General recently has endorsed. So this is no longer something that one agency does, one part of the UN system. It's a whole-of-system approach. How that's rolled out is a challenge that we have over the next 10 years, but at least we've taken the step to put that on the tables. The Secretary General refers to urbanization as a megatrend. It's something that affects all parts of society. It's something that has to be wrestled with to deal with these challenges that I described before. That's at the global level and in terms of intergovernmental processes in member states. At the municipal level, where our mayor here is very much involved, there are multiple platforms that exist for mayors to work together, to begin to cross-fertilize strategies, to learn from one another, and to have a voice as mayors in conversations that take place at the global level. So we have what's called a global task force on local and regional governments. It has essentially an umbrella body that is able to represent over 45 different networks, both thematic and representational, of local and regional government and city networks that are able to interface with the international community, are present in global meetings, have conversations directly with the Secretary General, which I've been privileged to be involved with. And there's a level of organization that's taking place at the city level that hasn't happened before. And I think this is partly their effort to rise to the occasion, recognizing that cities are where the action is. We estimate that roughly 65% of the Sustainable Development Goals are either going to be won or lost at city level. So how can cities be much more part of this conversation? I could talk a lot more about that, but we have an expert in the room. Please chat with her if you have a chance. She's directly involved in these processes, both in her own city and also linking to what's happening in other cities. But I want to indicate that it's not just government. Industry is also getting organized. A number of industries have decided to use the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework for being smarter about what their footprint is, both environmentally, socially, and towards economic development. It's not even. It's very poorly layered. I think the people that are in the room from private tech communities, information communication technology, and their counterparts in other parts of the world are at the head of the curve on industry. But there are sectors of industry, the building trades, the construction industries, that are very far behind. They're not part of this conversation, and yet they have a huge impact in terms of global city growth. There are many other industries, extractive industries, that are also very checkered. Some are involved in this process. Others are perpetuating unsustainable practices and need to be addressed. So there's a mixed picture that we're seeing from the private sector. And I think broadly the information technology and the technology questions that will be addressed over the next 2 days are informative about how that industry gets engaged in the whole broader question of sustainability as we move forward. My third point is not to limit this conversation to central governments, local governments, or private sector, but to really zero in on neighborhood-level interventions. And there are representatives here from different parts of the world who have really gotten into the weeds and details of organizing, and not only limiting themselves to a single issue, but using that way of bringing people together to get into more sophisticated efforts to map their communities, to enumerate, to engage in planning processes that lead to the level of consultation with city governments, with private companies, with the various professional associations, so that they're really driving their own development and co-producing development at the municipal level with their counterparts in government and the private sector. There are not that many of them. There need to be more. How is something like that brought and given greater visibility? The Mansueto Institute has been very strategic in helping neighborhoods, a subset of neighborhoods, look at how they systematically undertake the kind of practices and planning and enumeration and precedent setting that they've done in a number of cities to have a standardization of models so that cities and neighborhoods can look at what they've done over time and also begin to compare efforts and also be in sync with how municipalities budget and plan. So I think there's a very important precedent that this part of University of Chicago has set, and I'm very excited to partner with them on this to try to bring that conversation to a wider audience, to involve a greater cross-section of individuals, because I said at the beginning, the scale of this problem is so massive that if we don't start to get into this area of creative thinking and cross-fertilization of interinstitutional engagement, using neighborhood and social and economic justice as a grounding, we're really not going to be addressing the scale of the problem. So I'm excited that this group of people here today over the next 2 days is beginning to explore that question. There'll be a dedicated session Friday afternoon to look at how we may be able to establish some kind of platform to formalize these kinds of relationships, or at least experiment with that. And there are a number of opportunities. Let me conclude with how Luis had begun. I'm not Bernie Sanders and I'm not Barack Obama, but I did go to the University of Chicago. In fact, in this room, exactly 31 years ago today, not today, in May, I graduated from the University of Chicago. So it's a very interesting feeling, emotional feeling that you get to be in this space where you were some time ago. And I, like many people, really had trouble with the University of Chicago when I was here, but when I left and the time that I've left over time, it gets better and better with every year. And now I just rave about it to anybody who talks about it. And I say, are you kidding? The university is the greatest school on earth. Are you kidding? This place is amazing. So I've fallen into that trap that many graduates have. But jokes aside, the theoretical framework that I was subjected to, theoretical frameworks that I was subjected to, and the commitment to method, both qualitative and quantitative, is the legacy that left a footprint on me as an individual, which I have carried with me throughout all of my work, to think through and problem solve and be in a much stronger position to be an effective decision maker and civil servant. So thanks very much.